Just a housewife, Vanessa Holloway said with a soft laugh as she adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, and the people standing around her smiled the way wealthy people do when they want to pretend cruelty is sophistication. I stood there beneath the golden lights of the ballroom holding a champagne glass I hadn't touched all evening, suddenly aware of every wrinkle in my navy blue dress and every gray strand tucked into my bun. The Grand Crescent Hotel in Manhattan glittered around me like something out of an old movie. Crystal chandeliers hung from 30-foot ceilings. Waiters moved silently across marble floors carrying silver trays of lobster bites and champagne that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Everyone in the room seemed polished, important, connected. Everyone except me. Vanessa slipped her arm through my son Ethan's elbow and smiled at the group surrounding us. "Claire still acts nervous at these events," she said lightly. "She spent most of her life at home, so this world is a little overwhelming for her." A few people chuckled politely. Ethan didn't laugh, but he didn't defend me either. He just stared down at his drink with that uncomfortable expression I'd seen too often since he married Vanessa 3 years ago. I lowered my eyes and smoothed the sleeve of my dress with trembling fingers. "I'm fine," I said quietly. Vanessa tilted her head with mock sympathy. "Of course you are. Honestly, being a housewife is nothing to be ashamed of. Some women just aren't built for bigger things." The words landed softly, almost elegantly, which somehow made them hurt more. I felt heat rise into my face, but I forced myself to smile. My late mother used to say humiliation becomes unbearable only when you give other people permission to watch you break. So I didn't break. I simply nodded once and reached for my purse. Across the ballroom, cameras flashed as the evening's guest of honor finally entered the room. Julian Cross, billionaire donor, founder of one of the largest medical charities in the country. People immediately straightened their posture when he appeared. Conversations lowered into respectful murmurs. I had seen his face in magazines before, but in person he looked older than I expected. Tired, almost. There was silver in his dark hair and something distant in his eyes, like a man carrying memories too heavy to set down. Vanessa leaned closer to one of her friends and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "Imagine spending your life washing dishes while men like that change the world." More laughter. Softer this time. Sharper. I tightened my grip on my purse and took a slow breath. I only came tonight because of the strange invitation that had arrived 3 days earlier with my name handwritten across thick ivory paper. Claire Whitmore. VIP guest. No explanation. No reason. Just the time and location. Even now, I still didn't understand why I was there. Then something changed across the room. Julian Cross stopped walking. The entire ballroom seemed to pause with him. His eyes moved slowly through the crowd until they landed directly on me. Not Vanessa. Not Ethan. Me. His expression shifted instantly, as if the world around him had disappeared. Without saying a word, he stepped away from the city officials and board members surrounding him and began walking across the ballroom floor. Conversations faded behind him one by one. I could hear nothing except the sharp echo of his shoes against marble, and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Vanessa's smile faltered. Ethan straightened beside her. Julian stopped only inches away from me. For a moment, he simply stared at my face with eyes full of something so raw and personal it made my chest tighten. Then, before anyone in that ballroom could understand what was happening, he pulled me gently into his arms. I froze. His voice trembled against my ear when he whispered, "I waited for you." The ballroom remained silent long after Julian Cross stepped away from me. I could still feel the warmth of his hands against my shoulders as if my body had forgotten how to breathe normally. Around us, crystal glasses hovered midair. Conversations had stopped completely. Even the string quartet near the staircase seemed uncertain whether to continue playing. Julian looked at me the way people look at someone they lost years ago and never expected to see again. There was recognition in his eyes. Relief too. Deep, painful relief. "Mr. Cross," Vanessa said carefully, recovering faster than anyone else in the room. I think there may have been some confusion. Julian did not even glance at her. His attention never left my face. Claire Whitmore, he said softly, almost like he was testing whether the name was real. Hearing my name in his voice sent an uneasy chill through me. Yes, I answered quietly. Have we met before? His expression shifted slightly. Something between sadness and gratitude passed across his face so quickly I almost missed it. Not exactly, he said. Before I could ask another question, several photographers approached us, cameras flashing wildly now that the most powerful man in the room had abandoned senators and executives to stand beside an unknown middle-aged woman in a department store dress. Julian straightened immediately. The private emotion disappeared from his face as if a curtain had been pulled shut. Please excuse me for a moment, he said gently. There are things we need to discuss tonight. Then he walked away toward the stage while whispers exploded around the ballroom. Vanessa stared at me in disbelief. What on earth was that? She asked. Ethan looked equally confused. Mom, do you know him? No, I said honestly. I do not think so. But even as I spoke, something inside me felt unsettled. Familiar. Like hearing a song you have not heard in decades and suddenly remembering every word. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. That was bizarre. One of the women standing nearby smiled awkwardly at me now, suddenly eager to seem friendly. Claire, you never mentioned you knew Julian Cross. Because I do not, I replied. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Across the ballroom, Julian stepped behind the podium while the audience slowly returned to their seats. He spoke calmly about medical research, organ donation programs, and the importance of second chances. The crowd listened carefully, hanging on to every word. But several times during the speech, his eyes found me again. Not Vanessa. Not Ethan. Me. By the end of the evening, I no longer cared about the humiliation from earlier. Something far stranger had replaced it. On the drive home to Connecticut, rain slid softly against the windows of Ethan's black SUV while Vanessa replayed the night for the 10th time. I still think he confused you with someone else, she said. People like Julian Cross do not just walk across a ballroom to hug random housewives. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. Vanessa. What? I am just being realistic. I sat quietly in the back seat staring at the blurred highway lights outside the window. Housewife. The word no longer hurt the same way it had earlier that evening. It sounded smaller now. Almost meaningless. When we finally reached my small colonial-style home just after midnight, Ethan offered to walk me inside, but I told him I was tired and wanted to sleep. The truth was I needed silence. I stood alone in my kitchen after they left, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the old clock above the stove. My life had always been ordinary. Quiet. Predictable. I had spent 27 years packing school lunches, folding laundry, clipping grocery coupons, and making dinners that nobody remembered by the next day. Women like me did not end up in the center of mysterious moments with billionaires. Women like me did not leave entire ballrooms speechless. I loosened the pins from my hair and glanced toward the hallway mirror. For a long moment, I simply stared at my reflection. Then slowly, unexpectedly, a memory surfaced from somewhere deep inside me. A hospital corridor. Bright white lights. Rain against glass windows. And a young man lying unconscious behind a pair of closing doors. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Julian Cross standing beneath those golden ballroom lights looking at me as though I had stepped out of another lifetime. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was already sitting at my kitchen table wrapped in my old cream-colored cardigan with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands. Rain still tapped softly against the windows. The house felt unusually quiet, but then again, it had felt quiet for years. I reached for the small photo frame beside the sugar bowl. Ethan at 12 years old, smiling with missing front teeth and grass stains on his jeans. Back then, he used to run into the kitchen every afternoon starving after baseball practice while I stood at the stove making grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. He used to tell people his mother could fix anything. Funny how quickly admiration disappears once people start measuring success in dollars instead of sacrifices. My eyes drifted toward the hallway again as the memory from the night before returned stronger this time. Hospital lights. Rain on windows. A young man. I pressed my fingers gently against my temple. The memory still felt incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle buried under years of ordinary life. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Vanessa. I almost let it go to voicemail. Claire, she said the moment I answered, her tone unusually tight. Have you checked social media yet? No. Silence. Then, you should. After we hung up, I opened my laptop slowly, not entirely sure what I expected to find. Within seconds, my stomach tightened. Photos from the gala were everywhere. Headlines. Videos. Clips of Julian Cross leaving the stage to walk directly toward me. One article called me the mysterious woman who stopped Manhattan's most untouchable billionaire in his tracks. Another described me as a secret relative. Some people speculated I was an old love from his past. Others claimed I had once worked with him. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Thousands of strangers were discussing my face, my clothes, my expression. One video had already been viewed over 2 million times overnight. And there, buried beneath the comments, I saw Vanessa's humiliation spreading publicly too. Imagine insulting a woman 5 seconds before a billionaire hugs her in front of everyone. That daughter-in-law aged 10 years instantly. Never underestimate quiet women. I closed the laptop quickly. The attention made my chest feel tight. This was not my world. I had spent decades avoiding attention, blending into the background of everyone else's lives so completely that people often forgot I was in the room. Suddenly the entire country seemed to be staring at me. Around noon, someone knocked on my front door. I froze. Almost nobody visited my house unexpectedly anymore. When I opened the door, a man in a dark charcoal suit stood on my porch holding a leather folder against his chest. Mrs. Whitmore? He asked politely. Yes? My name is Richard Bennett. I work for Mr. Cross. My pulse quickened instantly. He asked me to personally deliver this invitation. He handed me a thick envelope sealed with dark blue wax. The paper alone looked expensive. Mr. Cross would like to meet with you privately this afternoon if you are willing. I stared down at the envelope without opening it. Why? Richard hesitated carefully. He believes you deserve answers. After he left, I remained standing in the doorway for a long moment, while cold autumn air drifted into the house around me. Then slowly, with trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in elegant black ink. Claire, there are truths that should have reached you many years ago. I am asking for 1 hour of your time. Please let me finally tell you what your kindness cost you and what it gave me in return. Beneath the note was an address in Manhattan and a time. 3 o'clock. I read the letter 3 times before my knees weakened enough that I had to sit down at the kitchen table again. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Sunlight pushed softly through the clouds for the first time all morning. And suddenly, after 27 years of believing my life had been small and forgettable, I began to wonder if the most important part of my story had never really ended at all. I arrived in Manhattan 20 minutes early because I could not stop my hands from shaking long enough to drive normally. The address Julian had written led me to a quiet private medical building overlooking the East River, nothing like the glittering ballroom from the night before. There were no cameras outside. No reporters. Just polished glass doors and soft piano music playing in the lobby. A receptionist greeted me warmly the moment I stepped inside, as though they had been expecting me all day. Mr. Cross is waiting for you upstairs, Mrs. Whitmore. Upstairs. The elevator ride felt strangely long. I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall beside me and suddenly became aware again of how ordinary I looked. Simple pearl earrings. Beige coat. Comfortable shoes. The kind of woman people pass in grocery stores without remembering 5 seconds later. Yet somehow, the entire direction of my life seemed to be changing because of one man's eyes. When the elevator doors opened, Richard Bennett was already waiting. "This way," he said gently. He led me through a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs. Most showed hospital wings, medical teams, and children smiling beside Julian at charity events. But halfway down the hall, one photo stopped me cold. It was old. At least 25 years old. A younger Julian stood beside a hospital bed looking pale and painfully thin, with tubes running from his arms. I slowed my steps. Something inside my chest tightened immediately. Richard noticed. "That photograph was taken after his transplant surgery," he said softly. My breath caught. Transplant? Suddenly the memory inside me sharpened with terrifying clarity. Rain against hospital windows. The smell of antiseptic. A doctor speaking quietly while I sat in a plastic chair holding paperwork with trembling hands. "Mrs. Whitmore," he had said gently, "your husband was registered as an organ donor." My knees weakened slightly. Richard opened a door at the end of the hallway and stepped aside. Julian stood near the windows overlooking the river, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He turned the moment I entered. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The room felt heavy with something unfinished. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. I nodded once. "I think you owe me an explanation." A sad smile crossed his face. "You are right." He motioned toward the sofa, but I remained standing. I needed answers more than comfort. Julian looked down briefly before speaking again. 27 years ago, I was dying." His voice stayed calm, but there was pain underneath every word. "A rare heart condition. I had less than 2 weeks left when the hospital called in the middle of the night and told me a donor had become available." I stared at him silently. "He continued slowly. That donor was your husband, Michael." The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. Michael. Even after all these years, hearing my husband's name spoken aloud by a stranger still hurt in places time had never healed. Julian walked toward the window again. "I was 28 years old. Newly married. Terrified. Your husband saved my life." Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Michael had died in a car accident driving home during a thunderstorm when Ethan was only 9 years old. One ordinary evening had shattered everything. I remembered sitting in that hospital hallway unable to process the words people kept saying around me. Organ donor. Consent forms. Procedures. Timing. I had signed papers through tears so heavy I could barely see the page. "After the surgery," Julian said quietly, "I asked about the donor family. The hospital would not tell me much. Only that his wife had agreed immediately despite her own grief." He looked directly at me then. I never forgot that. My throat tightened painfully. "But why now?" Julian exhaled slowly. "Because I spent years trying to find you." I blinked in confusion. "What?" "Your husband gave me my future, Claire. Everything I built after that surgery exists because of him. Every hospital wing. Every foundation. Every child helped through my programs." His voice softened. "And I could never thank the woman who made the decision that saved my life." I stared at him speechless while sunlight reflected softly off the river behind him. For 27 years, I had believed Michael's death had only taken from us our stability, our future, Ethan's childhood, my sense of safety. But standing there in that quiet office, I realized something impossible. Part of Michael's kindness had continued beating inside another human being all this time. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The office overlooked the gray autumn water stretching across the East River, but my eyes stayed fixed on Julian as though looking away might somehow erase everything he had just told me. 27 years. 27 years of believing Michael disappeared into silence after that stormy night. Yet here stood a man carrying proof that some part of him had continued living all this time. Julian slowly crossed the room and opened a small wooden box resting on the table near the window. His movements were careful, almost reverent. Inside lay a faded photograph protected beneath glass. He handed it to me gently. My breath caught the moment I saw it. Michael. Younger. Smiling beside an old pickup truck with Ethan sitting on his shoulders laughing into the summer sunlight. The photograph had been taken at a county fair nearly 30 years earlier. I remembered because Ethan spilled lemonade on Michael's boots that day and cried for almost an hour afterward. My fingers trembled around the frame. "How do you have this?" I whispered. Julian's expression softened. "The hospital gave me a small packet from the donor family years later after special permission was granted. There was no address. No phone number. Just that photograph and your husband's first name." He paused. "I kept it in my desk every single year afterward." Tears blurred my vision unexpectedly. Michael had always been the kind of man who helped strangers carry groceries in parking lots and fixed neighbors' fences without charging $1. Quiet kindness. The kind nobody writes headlines about. And somehow, even after death, he had done it one final time. Julian sat across from me slowly. "I tried to find you for years," he admitted. "But records were sealed. By the time my lawyers located your name, too much time had passed. I did not know whether contacting you would reopen old wounds." I stared down at Michael's smile frozen forever inside the photograph. "Why now?" Julian looked toward the river before answering. "Because last year I nearly died again." My eyes lifted sharply. He smiled faintly. "Nothing dramatic. A health scare. But it changes the way you think about unfinished things." His voice lowered slightly. "I realized I had spent half my life carrying gratitude I never gave to the people who deserved it most." Something inside my chest shifted painfully then. Gratitude. The word felt strange. For so many years after Michael died, all I remembered was exhaustion. Working double shifts at the grocery store bakery. Selling Michael's tools to cover mortgage payments. Watching Ethan pretend not to notice when I skipped dinner so he could eat more. Nobody ever thanked women like me for surviving difficult years. Survival was simply expected. Julian leaned forward slightly. "Claire, your husband saved my life. But so did you." I shook my head immediately. "I only signed paperwork." "No." His voice remained calm but firm. "You made a decision in the middle of unbearable grief that allowed another family to keep the person they loved. Most people never understand what that kind of courage costs." I looked away quickly because suddenly my eyes burned too badly to hold his gaze. For years I had let people reduce my life to grocery lists and folded laundry and PTA meetings. Even Ethan eventually stopped seeing the woman underneath the routines. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped seeing her too. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Richard stepped carefully into the office. "I apologize for interrupting, sir, but the board members for tonight's dinner have arrived early." Julian barely reacted. "Cancel it." Richard blinked once, clearly surprised. "All of it?" "Yes." Richard nodded respectfully and disappeared without another word. I stared at Julian in disbelief. "You are canceling an important dinner because of me?" Julian gave a small tired smile. "Claire, I spent 27 years trying to thank you. Trust me when I say there is nowhere else I would rather be tonight." For the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel invisible sitting across from another human being. I felt seen. Fully. Quietly. Completely. By the time I left Julian's office, the sky outside had turned the pale silver color that always comes before evening rain. Richard walked me downstairs quietly while my mind struggled to absorb everything I had learned in the last few hours. Michael's heart. 27 years. A stranger carrying part of my husband through an entire lifetime I knew nothing about. The revolving glass doors opened, and cold October air brushed against my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. Manhattan moved around me in loud, restless waves. Taxi horns? Footsteps. Voices. Yet somehow the world felt strangely still inside my chest. My phone began vibrating before I even reached the curb. "Ethan." I hesitated before answering. Mom, he said immediately, sounding tense. Where are you? In the city. With him? I looked up at the gray skyline stretching overhead. Yes. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then Vanessa's voice appeared faintly in the background, asking him something too quickly for me to understand. Ethan lowered his voice. Mom, people are talking about this everywhere. I know. Vanessa has been getting horrible messages online. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course, that was what worried them most. Not Michael. Not the years of sacrifice. Not the truth finally resurfacing after decades. Reputation. Image. Appearances. I never asked strangers to attack anyone, I said quietly. That is not who I am. Ethan exhaled heavily. Can we come over tonight? I almost said no. The old version of me would have said yes immediately, eager to keep peace inside the family no matter the personal cost. But exhaustion settled deeply into my bones. Emotional exhaustion. The kind that arrives when you suddenly realize how long you have lived without anyone truly listening to you. Not tonight, I answered softly. Ethan sounded surprised. Mom, I am tired. After we hung up, I stood there for another moment watching yellow cabs blur through wet streets, while memories kept surfacing one after another. Michael teaching Ethan how to ride a bicycle in our driveway. Michael leaving handwritten notes in my purse before difficult days. Michael kissing my forehead every morning before work, even during the hardest years. Somewhere along the way after his death, people stopped talking about him. Life moved forward for everyone else while I remained quietly buried inside survival. I drove home slowly through the evening traffic and reached Connecticut just after sunset. The house greeted me with familiar silence. I slipped off my shoes near the front door and stood in the dark living room without turning on any lights. Moonlight stretched softly across the hardwood floor. For years, this house had felt like evidence of everything I lost. Tonight, for the first time, it also felt like proof of something beautiful that endured. A soft knock startled me nearly an hour later. I frowned, glancing toward the clock above the fireplace. 8:43. Nobody visited unexpectedly in my neighborhood after dark. When I opened the door, I froze. Julian stood on my porch holding a small white bakery box in one hand while cold wind tugged lightly at his coat. He looked strangely uncertain for a man the entire world seemed to admire without question. I hope this is not inappropriate, he said quietly. You mentioned earlier that your husband loved apple pie. I stared at the bakery box for a second before letting out the smallest laugh I had laughed in years. Real laughter. Surprised laughter. Julian smiled faintly in relief. There is a diner in Brooklyn that still uses the same recipe from the 1980s, he explained. I thought perhaps... His voice trailed off gently. I stepped aside without thinking. Come in before you freeze to death. The warmth inside the house wrapped around us as Julian entered slowly, studying the family photographs lining the hallway walls. His eyes stopped on one picture of Michael standing beside me in front of our first home with Ethan asleep in my arms. Julian moved closer to the frame carefully, almost respectfully. He looked happy, he said softly. I swallowed hard. He was. Julian remained silent for a moment before quietly placing his hand against his chest, right above his heart. So am I, he whispered. Julian stayed for almost 2 hours that night. We sat at my small kitchen table eating warm apple pie on mismatched ceramic plates while the rain started again outside the windows. Nothing about the moment looked extraordinary. No cameras. No headlines. Just two people speaking quietly beneath soft yellow kitchen lights while the coffee maker hummed in the background. Yet somehow it felt more meaningful than every expensive gala ballroom in Manhattan combined. Julian listened carefully whenever I spoke, as though ordinary details about my life actually mattered. When I mentioned Ethan's childhood asthma, he asked questions. When I talked about Michael restoring old furniture in our garage on weekends, Julian smiled like he could picture it perfectly. Most people wait impatiently for their turn to speak. Julian did not. He listened. Truly listened. I had forgotten how rare that felt. Around 10:30, headlights swept briefly across my living room window. A car door slammed outside. My stomach tightened immediately. Ethan. I recognized the sound of his silver SUV before the front doorbell even rang. Julian looked toward the hallway calmly. Would you like me to leave? I hesitated. The old version of me would have panicked at the thought of conflict inside my home. But exhaustion had stripped something away over the past 2 days. Fear, perhaps. Or the constant need to keep everyone comfortable except myself. No, I said quietly. You do not need to leave. Ethan entered the house moments later with Vanessa close behind him wearing a cream-colored designer coat that probably cost more than my first car. Both of them stopped cold when they saw Julian sitting at my kitchen table holding a coffee mug in his hands. Vanessa recovered first. Oh. Her smile appeared instantly, polished and artificial. We did not realize you had company. Julian stood politely. Good evening. Ethan looked stunned. Mr. Cross. Julian is fine. Vanessa stepped forward too quickly, suddenly warm in a way she had never once been toward me before. Claire always undersells herself, she said with a nervous laugh. She has this way of surprising people. I watched her quietly from across the kitchen. 2 days earlier, she introduced me as nothing more than a housewife in front of an entire ballroom. Tonight her voice carried careful sweetness, every word measured like someone trying to repair cracked glass before it shattered completely. Julian glanced at me briefly before answering her. I do not find Claire surprising. His tone stayed calm. I find her remarkable. Silence settled heavily across the kitchen. Vanessa's smile flickered for half a second. Ethan looked down at the floor. I reached for my coffee cup slowly because suddenly my hands felt unsteady again, not from humiliation this time, but from the unfamiliar experience of hearing someone defend my worth without hesitation. Ethan cleared his throat awkwardly. Mom, we came because we wanted to talk. About? He exchanged a quick glance with Vanessa before speaking carefully. Everything online has gotten out of control. Vanessa folded her arms lightly. People are twisting things. I looked at her for a long moment. What exactly are they twisting? She opened her mouth, then stopped. Because the truth was simple. Nothing had been twisted at all. People had seen exactly who she was that night. Julian quietly set his coffee mug down. Public opinion fades quickly, he said. But how people treat others when they believe nobody important is watching usually reveals something permanent. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. Ethan rubbed a hand over his jaw, visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Cross, with respect, this is a family matter. Julian nodded once. You are correct. Then he looked directly at Ethan with calm, steady eyes. Which is why you should ask yourself why your mother spent years feeling invisible inside her own family. The room went completely still. Ethan blinked as though the question physically struck him. I lowered my eyes because part of me could not bear to watch the realization slowly forming across my son's face. Children rarely notice sacrifice while it is happening. They only remember whether dinner was on the table, whether clothes were washed, whether home felt stable. They do not see the woman quietly exhausting herself to hold everything together behind the scenes. Ethan sat down heavily at the kitchen table without being invited. For the first time since Michael died, my son looked at me not as background noise in his life, but as a person. The silence inside my kitchen stretched painfully after Julian's words settled over the room. Ethan stared at the table as though seeing it for the first time. Vanessa remained standing near the counter with her expensive coat wrapped tightly around her body, but the confidence she usually carried so effortlessly had disappeared. Nobody rushed to fill the silence anymore. Nobody laughed nervously. The truth had entered the room too completely for that. I stood slowly and began collecting empty coffee cups simply because my hands needed something to do. For years I had moved automatically whenever tension appeared. Refill drinks. Change subjects. Protect everyone else from discomfort. But tonight felt different. I no longer felt responsible for rescuing people from the consequences of their own behavior. Ethan finally looked up at me. "Mom," he said quietly, "why did you never tell me about any of this?" I paused beside the sink. "About your father being a donor?" He nodded slowly. "About everything." I looked down at the cup in my hands. "Because life kept moving." My voice sounded softer than I expected. "You were 9 years old when your father died. You could barely sleep through the night for almost a year afterward. You needed stability more than stories." Ethan swallowed hard. "Still, this was important." A sad smile touched my face briefly. "Most mothers spend their lives making sacrifices their children never notice. That is not your fault. It is simply how motherhood works sometimes." Julian remained quiet across the table, but I could feel his eyes on me. Not pity. Respect. There was a difference. Vanessa shifted awkwardly before speaking for the first time in several minutes. "Claire, I never meant to make you feel small." I turned toward her slowly. The strange thing was, I believed she meant that. Not because she had been kind. She had not. But because people like Vanessa often never realize how cruel they sound when they speak to someone they secretly consider beneath them. "You did not make me feel small," I answered calmly. "I already believed I was." The words hung heavily in the air. Ethan's expression broke slightly then, like someone finally understanding damage they helped create without ever meaning to. I rinsed the coffee cups gently beneath warm water. "After your father died," I continued quietly, "I stopped thinking about myself as a person with dreams or importance. I focused on surviving, paying bills, raising you, keeping food on the table." My fingers tightened briefly around the ceramic mug. "And after enough years pass, people begin treating you the same way you treat yourself." No one spoke. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while the old clock above the stove ticked steadily through the silence. Julian finally stood and reached for his coat. "I should go," he said quietly. Ethan rose immediately. "Mr. Cross, His voice faltered. "I think I owe my mother an apology." Julian glanced toward me before answering. "Then make sure it changes something." After he left, the house felt quieter than before, but not empty. Different. Ethan remained standing near the kitchen table while Vanessa stared down at the floor in silence. For the first time since their marriage began, neither of them seemed to know exactly who I was anymore. And truthfully, either did I. The next morning everything became worse for Vanessa online. Clips from the gala continued spreading across television segments and social media accounts. Commentators called her elitist, cruel, heartless. One magazine even published side-by-side photos comparing her expression during the insult to Julian embracing me moments later. By afternoon, one of Vanessa's charity boards quietly removed her from an upcoming event. Another organization released a carefully worded statement distancing themselves from recent public controversy. I should have felt satisfaction watching it happen. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Public humiliation changes people. I knew that better than anyone. Around 5 o'clock that evening, my phone rang again. "Vanessa." I almost ignored it. But something inside me said to answer. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it before. "Claire," she whispered, "I do not think anyone has ever looked at me the way Julian looked at you." I remained silent. Vanessa let out a shaky breath. "What does it feel like to matter to someone that much?" I closed my eyes slowly because after decades of feeling invisible, I was only beginning to learn the answer myself. 3 weeks later, the world had finally begun moving on to newer scandals, newer headlines, newer people to judge. The internet forgets quickly. But something inside me had changed too deeply to return to the woman I had been before that night in Manhattan. I noticed it in small moments first. The way I no longer apologized when speaking. The way I stopped shrinking myself during conversations. The way silence inside my home no longer felt lonely. One crisp November morning, I stood in my kitchen watching orange leaves drift across the backyard while sunlight warmed the countertops Michael built with his own hands nearly 30 years earlier. My coffee steamed gently beside me. The house smelled faintly like cinnamon from the muffins cooling on the stove. For the first time in decades, peace no longer felt like emptiness. It felt earned. Ethan visited more often after that night. Not out of guilt alone, though I knew guilt played its part. Something in him had genuinely shifted. He started asking questions about Michael. About our early years. About the struggles I never talked about while he was growing up. One afternoon he found an old box of unpaid medical bills from the years after Michael died tucked away in the hallway closet. He sat quietly on the living room floor reading every late notice and overdue statement with tears standing in his eyes. "You went through all of this alone?" he whispered. I folded a blanket slowly across my lap. "Not alone. I had you." Ethan shook his head painfully. "That was not enough." No. It had not been enough. But mothers rarely get the luxury of falling apart while children still need breakfast in the morning. Vanessa changed too, though more slowly. Humiliation had cracked something open inside her. The sharpness in her voice disappeared first. Then the constant need to impress everyone around her. One afternoon she arrived at my house carrying grocery bags and asked if I would teach her how to make Michael's apple pie recipe. At first I thought she was pretending again. But halfway through peeling apples, she suddenly started crying quietly without looking up from the counter. "My mother spent my whole childhood teaching me that worth comes from status," she admitted shakily. "Money. Appearance. Connections." She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. "I think somewhere along the way I forgot how to see people properly." I did not rush to comfort her. Growth requires sitting honestly inside shame for a little while. But I handed her another apple and kept teaching her the recipe anyway. Some wounds heal best through ordinary moments. Julian remained part of my life too, though not in the dramatic way newspapers kept trying to invent. We spoke often. Sometimes by phone. Sometimes over quiet dinners away from cameras and charity galas. He told me stories about the years after his transplant. The fear. The survivor's guilt. The endless feeling that he needed to earn the second chance Michael unknowingly gave him. And slowly, piece by piece, he helped me understand something I had never realized before. My life had mattered long before anyone wealthy or powerful noticed me. One cold December evening, Julian invited me to a private dedication ceremony for a new pediatric cardiac wing his foundation had funded in Boston. I almost refused. Large public events still made me uncomfortable. But when we arrived, I noticed something immediately. Above the entrance doors, carved into polished white stone, were the words "The Michael Whitmore Family Center for Cardiac Care." I stopped walking. My breath caught painfully in my chest. Julian stood beside me quietly while snow drifted softly across the hospital courtyard. "I wanted his name attached to something that gives people more time with the ones they love," he said gently. Tears filled my eyes too quickly to hide this time. All those years I believed Michael disappeared into silence after that storm. But he had not disappeared at all. Love rarely does. It changes form. It moves quietly through other lives. It survives in ways we cannot always see immediately. Julian reached for my hand softly, not romantically, not dramatically, simply human. Warm. Steady. Real. Together we stood beneath Michael's name while families walked through those hospital doors carrying hope inside their frightened hearts. And for the first time since becoming a widow nearly 3 decades earlier, I no longer felt like someone left behind by life. I felt like someone who had finally been found.